Hi everyone and good morning. And a very big welcome to Waterfront and today's pre-conference about sexual harassment and bullying. And to our international guests, also a very big welcome to Stockholm, Sweden. I know some of you have traveled far, so extra welcome to you, of course. Before we start, I want to say that this pre-conference is for you, but also for guests who will see this afterwards, so it will be filmed, so everybody knows that. My name is Calle Gustafsson, and I'm head of education at Friends. I have the great honor to moderating this pre-conference and guiding you as well as all the speakers here today. This conference is about the living conditions of children and young people and their experience of bullying and sexual harassment. Unfortunately, children and young people are not present in this room today. So they will be represented by quotes that you soon will see behind me on the screen. Quotes that come from Friends survey from 2021 that almost 20,000 kids and young people have answered. Quotes that are unfortunately all too common. Quotes that not should exist. Let's take a minute to read and get an insight into the everyday lives of children and young people. Today's conference aims to address research-based knowledge against sexual harassment and bullying among children and young people. And this conference is a part of a bigger project, a project that is funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers through the Nordic Gender Equality Fund. And the entire project aims to increase research-based knowledge about sexual harassment within organizations working against bullying in the Nordic countries and Lithuania, as well as their target groups. The main activities in the project are networking, but also sharing and dissemination of research-based methods. It will all result in a report that highlights knowledge in the project, as well as methods and tools. Methods and tools such as mapping tools for sexual harassment in schools, efforts that can change the school climate and unsafe places, efforts to prevent sexual harassment and exploitation online, knowledge of body image and porn, and an action plan course against sexual harassment. So the whole project is designed to share knowledge among the leading anti-bullying organization in the Nordic region and Lithuania, and to spread effective methods to prevent sexual harassment. All parties will bring their specific skills and perspectives, and we will meet them later here in this pre-conference today. So we say a big thank you to the Nordic Council of Ministers. So the key words today are sexual harassment and bullying. And in my opinion, sexual harassment is bullying and bullying is violence. And according to Agenda 2030, all violence against children must end before 2030. And I think we will get some ant steps closer to that goal today. But before we start, let me just begin to let me know who's sitting in this room here today. And we start with the best people in the whole world, my colleagues from France. Make a little sound or a round of applause if you're working at France. Great. And just let me check, do we have any teachers or educators or any who works in the schools? Please make a little sound. Okay, thank you. Do we have any researchers here today? How many in here is from Sweden? From Norway? Do we have anyone from Finland in here? Iceland, maybe? Another European country outside Nordic? From a country outside of Europe? I'm curious, which country? US. And did I miss any country or did I miss anything? Yeah, of course. Sorry. Do we have anyone from Denmark in here? Sorry, of course, an extra welcome. Thank you. It's time for the first presentation, and she should have been here live to present, but due to some flight traffic, she's not yet in Sweden. But thank you, Lord, for internet and for a camera and a microphone, so she has pre-recorded and sent it to us. The first speaker here today is Dorothy Espelage, Professor of Education at University of North Carolina and Chapel Hill. Over the last 22 years, she has authored over 200 peer-reviewed articles, 6 edited books, and 70 chapters on bullying, homophobic teasing, sexual harassment, dating violence, and gang violence. And she will talk of one of her latest articles that reviews research from 2010 to 2021 with a particular focus on longitudinal studies on the bullying sexual violence pathway. So even though she's not here, big welcome to Dorothy Espelage and a pre-recorded presentation.
Good morning. I'm Dorothy Espelage from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the United States. And I was hoping that I would be there with you this morning, but hopefully tomorrow. Thank you so much for the invite to present on this pre-conference looking at bullying and its relation to sexual harassment. I'm going to talk to you about our research program that many of my students over the years have been developing, and my colleagues, of showing the connection between bullying and sexual violence, which includes the sexual harassment that we're going to talk about this morning. Certainly I have 20 minutes to talk to you. It's not going to be an exhaustive review of our work, but it'll kind of set the stage for something that we've been working on for the last 10 to 12 years, and that's the bullying sexual violence pathway. Linking bullying as a precursor to both sexual violence as well as teen dating violence, because we know teen dating violence can include sexual violence. Thank you to the United States federal government for supporting this very, very important work. And my opinions and the research that we're discussing here are my opinions and not necessarily those of the United States federal government. So as you'll hear, many of my students have made their way to Stockholm, and excited to see all of you and share some of our work. This is just one piece of a research program that we've been working on for the last 20 some years. And so certainly I hope that you go and see my students' posters, and look forward to interacting with you in the coming days. And so when we think about bullying to sexual violence pathways, we do conceptualize this linkage as two forms of aggression and violence that are developmentally connected, but embedded within these larger social contexts. So not just individual characteristics, but how does bullying and sexual violence play out in schools, in classrooms, in communities, in families, and influenced by peers. And we certainly have a set of papers that look at the bullying to sexual violence pathway within these contexts. And I'll just highlight some of those research findings in the short time that we have. When we think about bullying and sexual violence and sexual harassment, we draw heavily upon the socio-ecological perspective and understand that schools or the lack of a positive school climate or the norms in a school can drive that connection between bullying escalating to sexual violence, as well as families, ideological underpinnings there, as well as the peer influence. So many peer researchers at this conference are going to talk about the power of the peers. Certainly we see that within the context of bullying, and certainly it's true for sexual violence as well. We also do draw upon heavily of the social interactional learning model. Meaning that a lot of these attitudes associated with bullying and the escalation to sexual violence and sexual harassment is embedded within the trainings in our families, and the attitudes around masculinity and dismissiveness of sexual harassment that set the stage for this bullying to sexual violence pathway. And certainly bullying is a gendered phenomenon for a certain extent, and sexual harassment and sexual violence and homophobic name calling or identity-based bullying also is considered to be in a gendered harassment framework. And so this is a model that we've been working on where we do draw upon kind of social interactional patterns as predictors, including child abuse and domestic violence, family conflict, sibling aggression, predictors of individual, predictors of bullying perpetration, but then bullying perpetration and involvement even as victims is a precursor to sexual harassment perpetration, as well as teen dating violence perpetration. And a lot of our work focuses on the perpetration side, knowing that perpetration and victimization are highly correlated, but we're one of the only labs across the globe that are specifically focused on perpetration. So I'm going to show you some data from a longitudinal study where we tracked American kids through middle school and high school. So years 5, 6 to year 12. So essentially about 10 years, 11 years old, upwards to 17, 18 years old. And certainly we have lots of papers that come from this data set, but I just want to kind of point out that there is a connection between this bullying and sexual violence. And so there's a series of papers here where we've replicated in this data set as well as other data sets that we have. We want to point out that when you're doing this work, certainly it has to be data driven, and our work has been data driven in that way and iterative. And when we do cluster analysis or late in class analysis around bullying perpetration, we find about 12% of males and females report engaging in these high rates of behaviors. Interestingly enough, when we ask them whether or not they call others homophobic epithets like "that's so gay" or "don't be don't be a fag," those types of things. We actually, when we do a similar analysis, we find that this is much more prevalent, at least in United States schools, in that 20% of females report engaging in high rates of homophobic perpetration, name calling towards others, which is a gender-based harassment. And 1 out of 3 boys report doing this at a high rate in the last 30 days. We have actually found that bullying and homophobic teasing and homophobic name calling, which is a form of sexual harassment, I want you to keep that in mind as you go forward in this pre-conference this morning. But they're not one and the same. So there are kids that engage in bullying. Sometimes we call it garden variety bullying, and that they will make fun of people, but they don't necessarily go into that gendered space of calling someone a homophobic epithet. So there are distinct, and this is just a confirmatory factor analysis to this effect, saying that they are longitudinally linked across middle school years. This is the first 5 waves of data, but they're not, if we were to put a one factor model on this particular, it would not fit as well as the two. So they are distinct as you move forward in thinking about this research. Our research is consistently found, so starting with Paul Petit's work in the early 2000s, and drawing upon some of Ian Rivers' works in the UK for the last 30 years, homophobic name calling is still prevalent in our middle schools. And we found that even in our 2019 data sets. Youth who bully actually resort to homophobic name calling, a form of sexual harassment over the middle school years, and we've replicated that into the high school years. I will continue to say this until I retire. Bullying prevention programs should include a discussion of language that marginalizes gender nonconforming lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth. In my keynote on Tuesday, I'll speak to some of the recent data that we have on that as well. And certainly when we then extend this study to, does this bullying to homophobic name calling then escalate to sexual harassment perpetration? It most certainly does. And we've replicated this in a few data sets. This is from the 6-year longitudinal study that we've conducted, but we've also replicated it in a more recent study of 2019. And we actually find that the interaction between bullying perpetration and homophobic name calling perpetration is very strong among males. And so what we see here is that as the, so this high bullying perpetration line that's dotted there, as a homophobic name calling goes up, and there's high levels of bullying perpetration, the risk for sexual violence and harassment perpetration goes up as well. So they seem to work together, especially for boys. So boys that engage in high rates of bullying and then also resort to homophobic epithets, remember they're different people, not necessarily the same, but that places them at risk for the highest sexual violence perpetration over time. We also implicate victimization in this as well. So if I engage in high rates of bullying and then someone directs homophobic name calling towards me, calling me those homophobic epithets, that actually drives the sexual violence perpetration. Put simply, if I'm a bully and someone, because this goes back and forth, the victimization, it's dyadic, right? So we can look to Christian Berger's work on this. And so we know that there's who bullies whom is important. If I'm then the target of that language, I have to demonstrate, as Nan Stein would say, and others in the field, I have to demonstrate that I am not homosexual or presumed to be homosexual. And sometimes the ways in which I do that is to sexually harass or engage in sexual violence in a public way, other peers. And oftentimes that may be friends. So it is that victimization and perpetration that is highly correlated, that is driving the sexual violence perpetration. Seems to be a stronger connection for boys, which makes sense, but it's still there for girls as well. And so some other paper, so this is a paper that says under revision, but it's actually out. And so 2021, where we reviewed the bullying sexual violence pathway, which is being tested in Canada, is being tested in other countries in Europe, which we're happy to see that folks are actually measuring that connection between bullying and sexual violence. It's a win as an academic, someone that's been writing about and encouraging folks to measure sexual harassment and sexual violence among their adolescents. We do find that high rates of bullying in middle school and high levels of traditional masculinity predict sexual violence perpetration. And so there is a malleable factor of traditional masculinity and addressing the multiple masculinities and the way to express that masculinity that's not often toxic. But also we find that both boys and girls in the binary sense are quite dismissive of sexual harassment, and that seems to be associated in explaining that connection between bullying and sexual violence over time. Take-home messages here: strong longitudinal associations between bullying, homophobic bantering, and sexual harassment perpetration. It seems as if that homophobic name calling, which we can address in our prevention programs by simply not allowing that language to happen in schools, and perhaps even talking to the adults about not using that language, it seems that we might be able to break this connection between bullying and sexual harassment over time. And so we really need to think about a comprehensive approach that addresses the climate that gives rise to this connection between bullying and sexual violence. We also need to think about prevention programming that counteracts the perceptions of gender nonconformity. And again, on my keynote on Tuesday, I will talk to you about those kind of particular identity, social identity groups that are at risk for this type of harassment. And so our research very clearly shows that there is a connection between bullying and sexual harassment. I think you're going to hear the rest of the morning of that connection in the non-USA context. So I'm excited. I wish I were there. I look forward to tuning in if I can. Bullying prevention programs need to incorporate the discussion of gender-based name calling, sexual violence, and gender expression where that is allowed, where the community allows this to happen. We also know from our work that when we do social network analysis, that birds of a feather flock together. So those kids that engage in high rates of bullying will socialize one another, either select each other or socialize one another to bully. But we've actually found in a number of papers over the last 10 years that those kids that engage in homophobic name calling and both sexual harassment perpetration tend to socialize one another to do that, especially if within that peer group they have that dismissiveness of sexual harassment, or also promote that traditional masculinity. Over time, that will influence them. A recent paper that came out in Prevention Science, we actually found that those kids that engage in verbal sexual harassment were well integrated into the networks using social network analysis. Interestingly enough, those that engaged in what we call contact sexual harassment or sexual violence or sexual assault are actually isolated, which suggests that the prevention programming may not actually get to them. So the messaging around addressing bullying and sexual violence, when we think about prevention programming, we may want to think about how to reach those isolated individuals and pull them in. But at the same time, remembering that sexual harassment, verbal sexual harassment, which is unwanted sexual commentary for the most part among adolescents across the globe, actually those kids are pretty popular. And so we need to think about how do we leverage their leadership, leverage their positioning in the network to shift it away from sexual harassment. But the ultimate goal here is to recognize that bullying does not occur in a vacuum, that developmentally, when you have things in place like hegemonic masculinity, toxic masculinity, school climates that do not address bullying and sexual harassment, peers that reward this type of behavior, we need to think clearly and much more deeply about our prevention programming to reach those kids that go from bullying to sexual harassment over time. And so again, I'm just going to leave you with this model that I hope that many of you are collecting these data and we can see how to replicate this globally. We do have lots of room for improvement to understand the bullying to sexual violence and to the teen dating violence connection. And that includes the friendship networks, school policies and practices, perhaps comprehensive sex ed, where there's multiple individuals represented within comprehensive sex ed and different types of relationship. Some of our papers, including one of my doc students that's there in Stockholm, Katie Ingram, has really looked at how does sports involvement promote this bullying to sexual violence connection, and how can we leverage sport for good to disconnect that bullying to sexual violence pathway. Anyway, I want to thank you so much. I hope to see you guys soon. I hope you have a great pre-conference. Take care. Bye.
Thanks to Dorothy Espelage for that, though she's not here. If we look at the schedule, we should have 5 minutes Q&A for Dorothy right now, but instead we will have some time for reflection. But please, if you have any question for Dorothy, keep them in mind and look her up when she comes here later this day, and maybe ask you questions tomorrow or on Wednesday if you will be at WABF, of course. But first, let's take 1 minute and think of what comes to your mind after you have heard what Dorothy have said. 1 minute, own reflection. Just to take some time and share my reflection, I want to start with to say that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm currently working at Friends. But before that, I was an educator for 6 years in an elementary school. I was not teaching that much, or I should say, I was maybe teaching a lot, but I didn't have so much lessons, because my mission there was only to work to prevent all kinds of degrading treatment, sexual harassments, all kinds of harassment, and of course, bullying. So after 6 years working with that in the school, and for 4 years as an expert and head of education as friends, there is one thing to come to my mind when I hear Dorothy speak, and when I read the quotes we did earlier. It is that there is no consensus on sexual harassment. There is no common language that students, youngs, grown-ups, principal councils use in the same way. And Dorothy spoke a little bit about that as well. And I think some groups of students in school make norms that they think that this is the way to act. And also other students think that this is the way to react, and this is what we should put up to every day, because they don't know where to draw the line. And where they draw the line is not the same where their parents draw the line and where the principals draw the line, because we don't see this in the same way. Also, when I worked as an expert and friends, talking to principals and council and giving them back the survey that we always ask questions about sexual harassment in school, it's very clear there is no common language in the staff group either. Not in every school, because some schools are really, really good at this, but many schools are not. Discussion on this issue shines with its absence in the staff group, and if we don't have a common language about sexual harassment, and if we don't know how to act and react when we see these in schools, how should the kids know? We need to give them the language to say, no, this is not okay. For themselves, and of course for others as well. That's just some thoughts from me. It's time to go on with the schedule, and I will present a dialogue about children's rights and challenges and experience. And I want to welcome up on stage Elisabeth Dahli, Children Ombudsman from Sweden, Gudridur Bolladottir, Children Ombudsman from Iceland, and also Hilde Enger Arntsen, who working with children and young people in Viken, Norway. And while you take your stand behind the small tables here, I will tell you in the audience that we now will have a dialogue about challenges and experience about children's rights. What's the similarities and differences in these three Nordic countries? What can we learn from each other? And what can we all in this room learn today and do differently from now on? Welcome. You have everything you want with water, and everything feels okay? Perfect. First off, a question that all of you will answer, and I want you briefly to describe how you work to strengthen the rights of the children and young people on these issues relating to sexual harassment and bullying. So just very shortly, give us a perfect. The mic will be on. I think that Elisabeth, maybe you could start.
Oh, should I start?
Yeah, you start. So give me your his pitch on how do you work to strengthen kids and young people on this issue?
I think for us, as the Government Agency for Child Rights, it's so important to have children's voices. I get very annoyed when I see a lot of people thinking that they know how the situation is for children today. And they said, I know how it was to be a child. Well, there was a huge difference of being a child in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even 90s. So we really need to involve children when we discuss what could be done, because things develop, and if we don't listen to children, whatever actions we do not have effect.
Thank you. Gudridur, how do you work to strengthen kids?
Good morning. Just a small correction. I'm not the ombudsman for children in Iceland. She's back in Reykjavik, but I'm a senior legal advisor and I work at the office, so I'm here representing the office. A pleasure to be here, so thank you so much for the invitation. I think our mandate is quite similar to the other Nordic ombudsman. Our role is to improve the situation of children and protect their rights and interests in every area of society. I would like to agree with Elisabeth on the importance of participation of children. And I think in particular when it comes to bullying programs, a lot of schools, a lot of local authorities claim to have a bullying program. And it's a stamp, it's something that you need to do. But it's not introduced, it isn't implemented, it isn't revised, and the children aren't involved. And because they have so much, it is their right to participate, but these cases are happening within their social reality, so they have such important information and input, and the participation of children provides us with better outcomes, really. So what we do is that we write a lot of boring letters to the ministries, which we hope they read, of course. But we are, of course, always looking for opportunities to educate, to cooperate. So we work in so many ways. I think that's enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Hilde, same question for you.
Thank you. And similar to Sweden and Iceland, Norway also have an ombudsperson for children. It was appointed by the king, and her name is Inga Beireng. But I work at the regional, I'm elected by the regional offices and at the regional level. And in Norway, we have anti-bullying ombud all across Norway, and I represent the area of Viken. There are 8 ombud in the area of Viken. It's surrounding Oslo, about 23% of the Norwegian population, so about 2.1 billion people. And in my experience, teachers and school personnel mostly have really good intentions, and they want to do better. But there is a need for further professional help and support, and a change in attitude to understand and accept the crucial importance of their role and responsibilities. Yes.
Thank you. You can keep the mic, Hilde. And the next question from me is that I also want all of you to answer is based on Article 2 that no child should be discriminated against, and Article 19 that children should be protected from all forms of violence from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. What is the single largest challenge that you face right now for children and youth based on these 2 articles? Hilde, what do you think about that?
I think that some of the largest some of the largest difficulties we see is that if you see at Ungdata research, I'll just find my paper there, it's regarded as the most comprehensive source of information on adolescent and health and well-being at the municipal and national levels. And for the first time in several years, we found that last year's report showed that there is no increase in mental health issues, so that's really good. 85% of young people in Norway are satisfied with their life, and as much as 80% said that they have everything they want. So I just want to emphasize that that's a really, really high number. But 7% experienced systematically being bullied, and as much as 14% reported about experiences of sexual harassment. So in no doubt there is a really, really large challenge about bullying and sexual harassment also in Norway.
Yes. Good, Hilde. What do you think is the single largest challenge to face right now for children and youth?
Really big question.
Yes.
I think violence is the main challenge, and we've seen a surge in the numbers of notifications to the child welfare services during COVID-19, and of course that's a positive thing. We want people to respect their duty to notify, but it still means that we have a larger group of children who are struggling at home. And we've also seen more children calling helplines, more children contacting our office, mainly discussing issues of difficult communications and relationships with parents during recent months. Although we haven't had proper lockdowns, but of course the daily lives of children have been disrupted. And what's really worrying is that they have lost the access to many of their support systems, which are the very important teachers, like you mentioned earlier, Calle. So that's a really worrying fact. Another thing, I think a main challenge, something we are going to focus on next year, and that's how do we change the education system? How do we foster a culture of inclusiveness? And I think Dorothy made such an important point about, for instance, sexual education, that it should include disabled young people. It should represent people of any gender or sexual orientation. And also I think subjects in school like social studies or whatever it is, they should be a part of it. So just make marginalized groups, include them in all the education system. And of course bullying is a big problem. I know you said one challenge, so I've mentioned a few, but it's a really big question. So a lot of challenge to work on.
Yes. Elisabeth, do you have the same thoughts as the other two, or do you have something else?
No, I think, I mean, we very much along the same lines, but I was thinking about the two articles, number 2 and number 19 in the Convention on the Right of the Child. But I think it's also important to see the convention as a whole. Yeah. There are so many other articles, in particular now as violence against children, they are part of the global goals. So I think we have to look in a more holistic way, and also to see the view of the Convention on the Right of the Child, both of the child's right of protection and a good childhood, and children as active and capable members of society. And I think we have to bear that in mind. And having said that, I think one of the big challenges that we see is that when violence or bullying or sexual harassment is so normalized that children don't even realize they are being harassed or they're being bullied. I think, at least in Sweden, we moved away from this boys will always be boys thinking, but we can see it penetrates here and there. And I think that is so important that children actually know where does the limit go. And we have to start already from preschool. And I think that we have a big program in Sweden now called Stop This Is My Body. You know, to be able to say no at a very early age. Now, I think another thing is the arenas where children are being bullied. Do we see them? You know, they're so more subtle, manipulated photos on social medias. Parents, teachers don't even know, because children are moving on different arenas where we don't see it. But I think there are two important things that we could see. There was a recent research by the Swedish Foundation for Children's Welfare, where they interviewed 3,000 children in high school about sexual harassment. And they could see that the number of children who had been sexually harassed had risen from 1/5 to 1/4. So 1 in 4 children had experienced sexual harassment. Girls at the age of 18, 1/3 had experienced sexual harassment. But what is interesting is also, is that the increased number because it's more harassment or because children actually know it's harassment? Lastly, very shortly, I think sexual education is so vital. We recently made a big academic study on the influence of pornography on children's sexual behaviors. And it was so important. What all the children were so clear about is better sexual education in schools, but also about human relationships as part of sexual education. I think that message was very strong from the children. Yes.
Elisabeth, you talked earlier, and everyone did, but you talked earlier about how we should involve and include young people, youngs and kids in the solution. Can you give some example for where children and youth have been involved as a part of the solution to reduce sexual harassment in some way?
I think there are ample examples, but I think we have to go locally or regionally on these. We can do some things when we do a lot of research in our office, and we always involve children. But I would say if a school or a football team or a preschool are going to discuss bullying, it's important to have the dialogue with the group involved to identify the spots in which it can happen. Because if we don't have that dialogue, with all the best intentions that we have, we might do the wrong things because they don't address what the children of today are seeing. So I think it's very much good dialogue, involve the children, and involve children in the evaluation. Otherwise, we will not move forward. Yes.
Thank you. I think that we have succeeded with our mission here is to terminate sexual harassment, and I think we have succeeded with similar efforts earlier. I mean, in the 50s, we in Sweden greatly reduced child mortality, and in the 70s, we were banning and sharply reducing corporal punishment for children, and that is that it sooner or earlier was okay to adults to hit their kids in the form of disciplining them. We banned that, and we have seen a greatly reducing. But what is standing in our way to do the same with bullying? If we have succeeded historically before, what is the main obstacles right now? Gudrun, what do you think?
Such a big question.
Yes, you seem to get them. That's the,
No, but I think it's a really good example that you mentioned the Swedish ban on corporate punishment, because I think it's a really good example on how you can actually change attitudes with the legislation. And I'm not saying because I'm a lawyer, so I'm a fan of legislation, but you can do that. And I think another example is paternity leave. Iceland was the first country to legislate on paternity leave, and so the legislation can become before the change of attitudes. But I think that when it comes to bullying, I think the duties of schools and local authorities could be cleared in the legislation. I think that's one way to go, so that it's not enough to just put a stamp in the box of bullying program, but you need to implement it and you need to involve children. So I think, and just having a clearer duty on local authorities to involve children, know the decisions, because I agree with Elisabeth, a lot of this work has to be done at a local level. So the government can do a lot of things, but where the things happen, that's basically at the local level. So we should eliminate local differences by being clear on what they are duty-bound to do. So I think a clearer legislation on the duties of local authorities would go a long way, definitely.
Thank you. Hilde, same questions for you. What's standing in our way to make this change?
It's a really large, big question, but I also agree that the principle of zero tolerance in legislation is really important. And in Norway, it was implemented in the Kindergarten Legislation Act this year. And that is to emphasize the importance it is for kindergarten and schools to have a clear attitude on this. But that in itself, it's not enough. I think that we are in crucial need of developing competence and skills for teachers, school personnel, and also children and young people themselves. And we think that developing good internal control operation systems so that the kindergarten and school owners in a satisfactory way can follow up their personnel, because we see that there is a lot of not only good practice examples. And that we see that there are many different types of services offering competence development training courses, different what is called things to help, anti-bullying programs, for example. And we think that kindergarten and schools should have the flexibility and freedom to choose what services that fits them the best. But these services should always be based on research and expertise.
Great. Thank you for your answers. Elisabeth, do you have anything to?
Yeah, and I think your question was very interesting, because 42 years ago, Sweden forbid corporal punishment. First country in the world to do so. Now we are about 76 countries. But I think that was interesting to see how you can use the law to change the normative framework and the attitudes. I mean, you won't see a Swede at a dinner party today talking about beating their kids. I mean, it's 3 generations of parents have learned something, and children themselves know. So I think in that case, I think that the legal instrument was important. Now, when it comes to changing attitudes to bullying, I think maybe the legal part could be there, but the problem is the duty bearers. And one thing is to say that schools must have a program, or that adults cannot bully kids. But who is a duty bearer when children are bullying each other? And how do we address who is the duty bearer? Which are the buttons that we can press? I think the legal way might be one way, but I think that we have to, I mean, one is the systematic part, that the schools must have a program. It must be evaluated. Children must participate. But I think it's a bit tricky to have like a national law. But I think it's the opportunity really to work more on the local level and really see what works and what doesn't work.
Yes, and as Elisabeth said, it was 3 generations ago maybe, but also, now we need to do this in 8 years because we have Agenda 2030, who states that all form of violence against children must end. And we're also talking about that we need to see a big change in the whole society. And what you are representing here today, what are your main tasks in the next 8 years to reach the goal in Agenda 2030? Hilde, please, can you start?
To end toxic masculinity, for instance, that would be one way. But I think that children and young people needs to learn from a really, really young age how to interact with others in a safe and healthy and positive way. And I'm so happy that in Norway we have in the curriculum now an interdisciplinary topic called health and life skills. That's we haven't had that before. How to have health and life skills, and it's actually the first time mental health is used in a Norwegian curriculum ever. So I'm positive that if we start at a young age giving children and young people tools to see themselves in the world as important and as that their contribution to the society affects themselves and others in a positive way, I think that we can start to make a change in how we see bullying and also sexual harassment.
Thank you. Good leader. From what you're representing here today, what do you put up on the table to help us reach the goal in 2030?
Just going back to the discussion on child participation, I think that's a really important issue. And I also think it is about education, and I think it's so important that we educate our children of the fact that they are rights bearer, and we need to do it from an early age, because if you educate someone and you inform them, you treat them as a rights bearer, they learn to respect others as rights bearers. So I think it's just going back to basics, and I think we need to educate parents as well. Parents need to know that children are rights bearer. Professionals working with children, it should be a vital part of their education to recognize and respect children as rights bearers. So I think that's sort of just going back to basics. And also I think child participation is such an important tool, and I think we can do a lot of preventive work that way. And I would just like to mention an example that we are working on, and we have a biannual children's forum, which is a completely new thing, and it's in our legislation, so we have to do it every second year, and we love it. And what we did is that we randomly chose children from all over the country, from the National Register, and we invited them to the biggest and most beautiful conference building in Reykjavik, and the children set the agenda. And this has actually been criticized because people think it's undemocratic that the children should be chosen and we should choose the most excellent children. But those children are already participating. They are participating everywhere. So we have children who are disabled, we have children with a different background, all kinds of children. So they actually sort of represent the snapshot of children in Iceland of a certain age. We don't have children from every age. So I think venues like this are so important to have the voices and experiences of children, but not the small group who already are meeting ministers, who already have a venue, who have a platform, who have a voice. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yes. Elisabeth.
Yeah, I agree a lot with what you have said. Just to add, what we do is a lot of research and to see, how does the anatomy of violence look of today when it comes to children. And one group we've been working very much with is transgender children, to see, and young transgender children, how can they get a voice, what are their needs? And as well, we are conducting a major research on racism as a ground for violence. But I'd also like to mention, since you talked about the end violence and the global goals, we have this huge partnership, End Violence, and before I started this job, I was actually on the board of that. And I think it's so important when we look on the global goals, and it's the partnership. Because with the partnership against violence against children, the governments, it's the UN, it's the private sector, it's the civil society, and the faith-based organizations. And if we really want to have a big global change in attitudes, we need to involve all the people who can who can push the needle. And I think in that part, it's been so important to exchange experiences on the house. What works in Sweden might not work in the US, but that might be something in Norway that works very well in Canada. And we need to really see, what are the solutions. And there will be another solution summit with the End Violence coming up in December. And I think it's so important not only to define the problems, but really to share the solutions, because otherwise we will not do very much in the next 8 years to come.
And I think that we are 3 persons gathered here from 3 different countries in the Nordic now here today. Is there anything else that we can do together in the Nordic countries, you think, Gudrider? How can we help each other in this issue?
Because Elisabeth mentioned international cooperation, and I think because we have similar societies in many ways. A lot of us come from small towns. We have similar systems, similar culture, values, etc. So I think more Nordic cooperation. I think that could be a way, definitely. Yeah.
Hilde, what do you think? What is the next Nordic cooperation? What should that focus on, and what could we do there?
I think that this pre-conference is a large part of a larger project that's really, really interesting. And I think that those kind of networking and sharing experiences also on the topics on different minority youth should be, we should do more of that. I know that there's some of the work are already started, but I think it's really, if we see that how we treat our different minority groups, how the positive effect will gain the others and the majority. I think that we have a lot of different experiences to share in a positive way.
Yes. Elisabeth, with your knowledge and experience, will we reach the goal in Agenda 2030? What do you think? 8 years from now?
I wish, and I hope. But I think it means we have to do a collective effort, and we really have to look what works, what doesn't work, and how can we push the needle together. And I think, again, I really want to come back with the global goals about the partnerships. We have to involve more, and we have to offer and share experiences of what works. I think that can do a big difference.
Thank you. Thank you to all 3 of you. Give them a round of applause, I think. Hi, everybody, and welcome back from this tea and coffee break. During the break, I had the great honor to get some new information that we actually have young people and students in the room. We have 2 very nice guys from Student Council in Norway. So an extra welcome to you. They said to me, they are more than quotes. And of course you are. So thank you for giving me that information. We will continue this pre-conference with a new presentation from Professor Katja Jelander-Godin from Department of Health Science in Mid-Sweden University. Katja has worked with public health issues since the late 80s with several different specializations and is today one of Sweden's most experienced researchers on children and young people experience of sexual harassment in school environment. She will talk about the student participation in this issue and something called Photovoice, and I'm very interested to hear more about that. So a big welcome to Katja.
So, thank you. And I start to thank you for inviting me as a presenter at this important conference. I'm going to present some results from a participatory action research project in an upper secondary school in rural Sweden, focusing sexual harassment and other forms of gender violence against girls. And it was conducted 2017 to 2020. And we started in September 2017, so it was before Me Too. But in October, November, and during the fall, Me Too swept like a wildfire over the world. And Sweden is one of the countries where it really shaked a lot of organizations, communities, and institutions. And this is a list of some of the calls. And 3 of the calls come from the school. 2 from pupils, hashtag quiet in class, hashtag raise your hand, and also from teachers, hashtag not approved. And the question is, of course, what are the prerequisites for working against sexual harassment when also female teachers are exposed to sexual harassment from their colleagues? And the study I'm presenting today is a part of a larger project which is in cooperation with the researchers from South Africa and Sweden. But today I will only focus on the Swedish part and on the first aim here, which is to use participatory visual methodologies as a way to highlight the experience of violence and also critical engagement of girls and young women. And the researchers we are working with are really, really experienced in visual methods for social change. So you have Photovoice, you have self-films, you can work with art and different ways to involve children in this work. But there are, so far, among those visual methods, we have used Photovoice, which is a health promotion method developed by Caroline Wang and Mary-Ann Burris. And it's a participatory method and developed particularly for groups that are more disadvantaged, that has less power and influence in society. So Photovoice it has 3 goals. One is it's a tool for documenting and portraying the everyday life of through photography. And also using those photos, they are used in group discussions where the participants discuss the common problem and discuss their own strength in the community, but also challenges that they have. So they get like a collective understanding of the problem. And the next step is to develop strategies to reach policymakers, which is to reach those who really can do something about it. And the strategies can include, for example, a phone call, writing letters, but often it ends in an exhibition as a way to reach the target groups. And the woman you see on the picture here is a politician and expected, maybe, to be our next prime minister. And this presentation includes 35 girls from 3 different programs and divided in 5 groups. It was from vocational programs, a vocational program, a theoretical, and also a program called language program for newly arrived girls. And we started with like a warming up prompt, you see, what contributes to safety and unsafety for girls and young women in society. So they started to think about this, and they took photos of what makes girls feel safe or unsafe. And it was a way to warm up to discuss the ethical issues in relation to taking photos, and also to be familiar with the way we conducted the workshops afterwards when we discussed the photos, where all the girls or the participants in other projects talk and show their photos, one in turn, and it's like a protocol how you conduct those workshops. So we ask them to focus on girls and women in general in society, not their own experiences. And so the next prompt was, what are the different forms of harassment and violence against girls in your school or community? And also, what are the consequences of such violence? So even if we targeted the girls and asked them to discuss strategies against violence, it does not mean that we see them as responsible for the solution, but using their knowledge and competence to identify possible solutions and identify those who can do something about it. So it's about what can we learn about violence against girls from the girls themselves. And the girls, they decided that an exhibition would be a good thing to present their photos and so. And here you can see one of the exhibitions in the schools, in the school. And as you can see also, it's quite big posters, and there were many of them, as we had 5 groups, and there were a lot of photos, and we decided to make it more comprehensive. And I will show you some of the posters soon. But a comment, just a moment, let's see. Yeah, so all boys at the school, the teachers and all the staff and all principals in the municipality were people that, groups, organizations that they wanted to reach. And also newspapers and other media, and they wanted to show this for the municipality council and a lot of different organizations. And a comment, which is, was that they wanted the boys to see it, but they didn't want the boys to watch it in groups because of the risk that they would be ridiculed. And one girl said also, and it's the same thing with daddies. Don't let the fathers go in groups because they easily fall back. That's quite depressing comment, actually. But we, together with the girls, we made like a shorter exhibition, and I will now show you some posters and photographs from the prompts, and I hope that you will get a feeling of the power of the photographs, the visual. And the girls divided the violence into physical violence, psychological violence, and they also defined online harassments as a third form of violence that they wanted to highlight as a known form. And this is some of the photos from the physical. And this is another one, and it's about bullying, it's assault, it's about rape, sexual harassment, dating violence, and so forth. And they also identified in these pictures different places where the violence and harassment can occur, like the festivals, at home, in school, on the bus. And they concluded that they are actually at risk almost everywhere. And ska vi se om jag backar. So they also were, if I back to this, they discussed rape, and they thought that it's both physical and psychological violence. So, but it was on the physical one on this poster, and it's also psychological violence, and that concern to be diminished, to be labeled, to spreading rumors, and to be threatened. And they talked about the different rules for boys and girls and how boys can behave, like sexually, without negative consequences, but there's completely different rules for girls. And it has been a recurrent theme that girls are seen as objects, that they are categorized from their clothes and behavior, and that normative attitudes such as calling girls whore or slut leads to a lot of negative feelings and also a limited space of action for the girls at school and elsewhere. And you see the photo there up in the right corner. It's a girl who wanted to show that words are not only words, but how they get stuck and become like engraved on the body and the person. And you see the picture of the eye. They're also talking about how they were scanned and felt undressed, and like 1 second felt like, they said, feels like 15 seconds when they are looked in a particular way. And we also have a third form of violence, the digital violence or online harassment. And it was extremely present in the girls' lives. And it's problematic from several aspects. It's very often anonymous. It can be anyone near you at school or somewhere, and you can be exposed anytime, 24/7. And home is a place where you are expected to be safe, but you can get, for example, so-called dick pics whenever. So this form of violence, online harassment, is almost impossible to avoid, and it can penetrate all situations, even if you live rural and deep in the Swedish forest. And the picture you see there of the dick pic, it's one of the creative photos. It's actually a carrot. So it's just a vegetable, if you wonder. And this is, before I continue to show you the posters of consequences, this is one that I want to show you specific, because it's quite dramatic, and it's taken by a girl who wanted to visualize suicide ideation and suicide as the ultimate consequence from online harassment. And this is a picture that has made very many people to react quite strong. And this is how serious some of the girls think it can be. And you can read what's on it. And they were also, so if we go to consequences, so it's about poor grades, that the poor grades, maybe they have to quit school, and if they quit school, they get worse jobs. And they also talked about isolation and mental health problems like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, medication, and also feeling insecure, because they talked about they had to have makeup to feel safe, so they got some kind of appearance fixation, and also it was feeling unsafe and being the one who has to escape while the perpetrator stays. And they also had more dramatic photos, and it was about self-harm and suicide ideation. So, and just short, this is a participatory action, like research method, but you can also use it as a practitioner. You don't have to be a researcher to use it. To use it as a way to involve young people, for example. But also, I want to show you as a researcher, because even if it's a action research method, it's also a method that render a lot of data. And it's rich data, because you meet these, in this case, these girls several times and workshops. So we transcribed all the workshops, and when we discussed the photos, we have made, like, so far 2 publications from those workshops. And this is from one of the papers. And this is the result from an analysis of gendered violence facing girls in their everyday life in rural Sweden, as experienced by the girls themselves. And it's from a published study, and it's I have a thesis with 2 of the publications, so you can find them on internet, but I also have some copies if someone are interested. And our interpretation is that girls, they lived in constant fear. One was the fear of being raped, and the other fear of being labeled, for example, called slut or whore, and also fear of being excluded as a result of the label. And the girls, they had strategies to handle this, and one was to be like appropriately sexually active, not too much and not too little. And the appearance is important, and they are consciously or unconsciously also how they perform so they feel safe. And I will give an example of the unconscious strategy. It was a girl who said that, oh, I don't feel unsafe when I go out in the dark because I always go with a friend. And it's of course a strategy to feel safe, and she wasn't even thinking that it was a strategy, that she always went out with a friend. So it shows also how normalized it is to constantly think how to behave, how to act to feel safe. Yes, and Photovoice, we say it's a visual methodology for social change, and an important question is, of course, did the project make a difference? So we know that the girls were happy that and content that they had a chance to discuss a problem that seldom is highlighted in the school and almost never talked about, not even among the girls themselves. And we know that some of the girls started discussions at home with their fathers, brothers, and boyfriends. And the exhibition was presented and discussed in a variety of different contexts. You can see here where we were reaching out. It was in the school, it was in the municipality, it was in the county, the governor, to NGOs, and international and national conferences. And also the research graduate student in this project, she was employed part-time during 1 year to reach out to politicians and civil servants in the 7 municipalities in this county, in this rural county. So we know that the politicians and civil servants are informed, but then of course comes the next question, did anything really change? So in this case, we don't really know. We just know that a lot of people are really informed. And but we know from international research that the method can be an important method for actually reaching social change. So, a conclusion, Photovoice is a visual method that can give girls the opportunity to tell and give their perspectives. And Me Too showed that how important it is to actually be able to tell and to prevent the culture of silence. We need to develop strategies to engage decision makers, which means those who really can make a difference and not put the responsibility on the girls themselves. And for us as researcher in public health, it's very important that questions of sexual harassment actually is included in questionnaires where you are interested in health or safety or whatever. In Sweden, it's I think all of the questionnaires include questions about bullying, but sexual harassment isn't that common yet. We also, of course, have to develop methods to engage boys. So also, when we do quantitative studies and cross-sectional studies, it's always a question: is the mental health problems, is this a causal effect? What comes first? But the girls in this study, they had no problem at all to see that it was the violence had a direct consequence for mental health problems or physical or actually limited action space, and also it's also a way to uphold an unequal gender order. And the last, as I said, we don't expect the girls to take responsibility, so we also have to develop methods to engage the boys. And with that, I say thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Katja, for that. And we will also have a couple of minutes questions or possible questions from the audience. So if you're sitting here right now and have thoughts or questions for Katja, please, maybe we should do as they do in school, raise your hand, and I will give the word to you, and you have the possibility to ask your question. Do we have any thoughts or questions from the audience? You have make yourself glass clear.
Perfect.
No questions at all.
So,
I have a question for you, Katja, though. Now we have shown this. What's the next step for you? You have said something about the conclusions here. What will you research? What will you do and work with the few years we have left until Agenda 2030?
well, one thing, we have applied for a study where to do research on a possible social change. What happened with those politicians and civil servants that actually got this information and knowledge? But that was rejected, so far we don't know. But I have, together with my colleague Helen here, started a project with focusing online harassment. And we have also planned and got funding for a project where we will use another visual method, which is self-film, where you are using not only cameras with a photo, but also making films. So that is something we will continue with to combat and work against online harassment and involving the young people.
Okay, thank you. And what do you think? Do you think, as the same question that the panel got here earlier, do you think we will reach the goal in 2030, or what's your opinion on that? It's a hard question, I know.
Well, I
got
say
8
the same.
years.
I really hope so. I think we have to do all we can to come as far as possible. But of course, it's a really challenge.
Of course. One more chance from the audience. Do we have any questions for Katja? Of course, Katja, you also have a small present from us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will tell the audience that we will listen to a panel of experts from Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, and Iceland, and where they will talk about their experience on this issue. And I first have to say that I'm sorry because I used the wrong name. We don't have Hilde here, we have Brundis, sorry. Brundis Jonsdottir, sorry. You are also welcome, of course. Take water, take what you need. First off, please just let me know a little bit about how you work. A short presentation of your organization and the work that your organizations do based on sexual harassment and bullying. And I think we should start with Friends, Åsa. So, what do we do?
What do we do? Friends is an NGO. We started in 1997 by a girl named Sara Damber, and she was at that time 19 years old, and herself she had experience of being subjected to bullying during her many years in school. And since then we have developed and became one of the largest anti-bullying organization in Sweden. And what we provide is research-based tools for adults who works with children in preschools, schools, and sports clubs to prevent bullying and promote equal rights.
Thank you. Same question for Maria and Jenny. What does Folkhälsan Finland do and what do you do there?
Yes, it's Maria and me representing Finland and Folkhälsan. And Folkhälsan is a non-profit social and health organization working to provide well-being and the quality of life in the Swedish-speaking areas in Finland. So we carry out health promotion, research, education, but also service production. And the health promotion, the anti-bullying work belongs to the health promotion part. So our team is called Safe Relationships, and it consists of 7 people. And we work with bullying prevention, sexual health, and gender equality in early education, in schools, in sport clubs, and we offer training in how to prevent and intervene in bullying, as well as networks for professionals, both for school professionals and early educational settings. And we also develop methods and materials and work close to research project concerning the topic. And Maria will tell a little bit more about the materials later on.
Great. Smilte, please, what do you do in Lithuania?
Yes, I'm representing Childline. It is a national helpline for children and youth under 18 years old. And so our main mission is to provide emotional support for children via the telephone, via internet, and children can call us or chat with counselors or write an email. So it's our main mission. But also we try not just to listen to children's voices, but also to be children's voices in the society, and to raise awareness in some important issues that is important for children. And so why in 2004 we started initiative campaign without bullying. And so during this initiative, during this campaign, we organized different activities in society level, like campaigns of raising awareness, in school level by promoting or by providing some trainings for school teachers, for other staff, and also in some individual level by providing this emotional support. And so if we talk about sexual harassment, we just started to work with this topic, but in bullying prevention we have some experiences.
Thank you. Bryndis, please describe for us what does Home and School do?
Yes. So Home and School is a national parents organization. So we work with parents in preschools and in middle schools and high schools, and also from 0 to 18, basically. We also run the Safer Internet Center in Iceland. So our projects are maybe more widespread than some of the other organizations, because we work a lot with parents on how to be a school parent, how to work together to strengthen the relationships and the good behavior and the good communication of children. We have been running some projects like Kids with Kids. And there we educate the parents and also the 9th graders of each school, and they're trained to then work with the 8th graders to build on friendship and good communication and a good class spirit. We also go and meet usually 6th and 7th graders to talk about online behavior. And bullying is one part of that, of course. We are now on the 9th of November, we are organizing the Day Against Bullying in Iceland, and we usually will encourage the schools to do something to emphasize the work against bullying in their schools. So they some schools will have like friendship walks. They will hold hand in hand to walk around their school and do some significant projects. We are also like rewarding a project or a person each year that has been like outstanding in the work against anti-bullying. We would do so too. I personally, I would rather that we call the Day Against Bullying the Day of Friendship and Cooperation and Good Communication, because I think we have to focus more like on the positive things that we want to do rather than focusing on bullying, the negative side of things. And I can quote, there was a TV presenter who was asking a person on set, why are girls still sending nude photos of themselves in spite of all the discussions in the society? And he was very much criticized for these words, and it was questioned that why he was not addressing the men who were pressuring the young women, and said, why are men still asking young girls for photos in spite of all the discussion in the society? So we have to I think change the focus a little bit and focus on what we can do to prevent and how we can enforce good communication and friendship, instead of always looking at the victim and everything that's being done to them.
Yes.
So prevention all the way.
Yes, thank you. Maria and Jenny, a question for you. As I hear, there are great similarities between this organization, but some difference is the target groups maybe. We have kids directed to kids and parents, and you working with schools. What could you say are the most common questions from schools? What do they need for kind of help from you? What are their biggest challenge to prevent bullying?
Oh, that was a big question. The
I
biggest.
like big questions.
Yeah, but I think knowledge and time, of course.
Yes.
But I think nowadays, when we see a lack of personnel in early education, change of staff, for example, we can see it's difficult to get the whole personnel to come to hear about preventing bullying and to get knowledge about bullying and sexual harassments. Maybe the key person that was working with bullying prevention has left the daycare center. So I can see a challenge there, that you sometimes want these quick fix solutions, 1 hour courses, and we know to get the real change, we need to work every day, all the time, with the whole school community or daycare community, also on a society level. So I think lack of time and resources sometimes is a problem.
Yes. Thank you.
And I think also because we have the same experience here in Sweden, and as I think for the first dialogue, Elisabeth and the other was talking about the importance with both the whole school approach, but also the local and the region approach. So it's just, I mean, when it comes to bullying prevention or prevention sexual harassment, it's not a school problem, it's the whole society problem in one way, I think.
Yes. Smilte, the same question for you, but as I understand, you work more directly towards kids through this telephone line and emails and chats. What is the most common question you got from kids in Lithuania?
So the most common topics is a relationship with parents. So in the first place, I would say. Then there's a lot of children that talk about relationship with peers and different kind of problems on that. And bullying also is one of the first topics that children are talking a lot. And what is interesting, if we just look 10 years back, so bullying, it were not so big issues between children. And we have a feeling that when we start to talk more about that bullying is not normal behavior, that you need to talk about it, children become more aware about this behavior, and they start to talk more with us about this problem. So now we have very big issues, and there we have a lot of children talking about bullying as the other problems, like problems with peers or problems with parents.
Yes.
Yes, Maria.
Yes.
I could just mention that I think that was interesting that you mentioned the relationship with parents, because we have the same issues that school teachers, early childhood educators, they're a little bit sometimes afraid of the relationships and how to address the issues in a way that isn't shaming or putting some what do you say, some kind of that you exclude someone and in the way of matter. So I think the relationship with parents are really crucial, that you feel safe to address the issue, because if you don't feel safe, you won't see it happening. So I think that's a really important thing.
Yes.
And also that you start early on to talk about these issues, because with Jenny and I, we work with bullying prevention among small children in early education, and we can see that at like 10 years ago, we had this question, is it happening among small children? Is it possible that they bully each other? So, yeah, we need to start early on.
Yes. Bryndis, what do you say? Because as I understand, you work a lot with parents. Do you have got the same questions from them?
We have a wide range of questions from parents, and some of them regarding bullying, and some of them just advice how to work with the school. We work closely with the helpline, the Red Cross helpline in Iceland, and they tell us that almost every call they get from children now is involving online harassment. So that's a really big thing. We also have a big thing going on in Iceland now. I don't know if you have seen in the press, but we have had several members of the national football team being accused of domestic violence and sexual harassment and even rape. And we have had some footballers removed from the national team because of this. And this is, I think it's like, has brought up the discussion of this masculine toxicity in Iceland. And actually it's a rather fun fact that the board and the board had to resign because of this from the National Football Association. And the new president of the National Football Association is the first woman to do so in Europe, and she is actually a specialist in bullying and has been working a lot with us. For example, the Kids with Kids project is her idea that we processed with her and worked with her. So we are working closely with parents and the kids. I would say what I take from our education to the younger children and also the teenagers is that when we meet them, we've been meeting them to talk about online safety, and also we have been working with a sex educational specialist, and we have been going around with them and talking to kids. And we feel that the kids desperately need someone to talk to. When we come and we open the discussions about these matters, there's a flood because they need so much to talk about it. And they have been carrying with them issues like there is no platform for them, not at home, not in the schools. And we have to make these platforms available for kids to talk about their experience, to talk about and ask what is right, what is wrong. I'm sorry, I'm so dry in my mouth. And I think that's the most important issue is to build a platform for kids to be able to communicate, to get advice, and so on. When it comes to communication, bullying, and sexual harassment.
Yes. Thank you. Åsa, now we've heard a little bit about your organizations, your target groups, and what their biggest challenge are. Can you please mention a method or a tool that you use in the preventive work against bullying or sexual harassment?
Yeah, try. But I think for more than 10 years now, we have within the organization used a mapping tool for schools, teachers, first-handed a survey for students from age 6 up to the whole way during school up to 18 years old, and that survey is to map, or I should say, students will answer questions with themes of well-being in school, experience of different forms of bullying and harassments, and how they feel and if they feel safe, and how in what way they are involved within the fair and equal work within school. But then since a few years back we also included questions about sexual harassments, but we knew from the results that we didn't get the figures that we knew it was more common. Yes. So we contacted Katja, who you heard before, and her colleagues to develop a new survey that just focusing on behaviors that you could include in sexual harassment. A tool, a mapping tool to just focus in on sexual harassment, because like you all said, there is no common language in school for students to express what they are experience when it comes to different forms of sexual harassment. And I think that we have a responsibility to get them to be able to answer questions of different forms of sexual harassment. So in that survey, we have different themes to express harassments, and that is verbal name calling, physical forms, like you also said in Katja's former presentations, but also public displays at school and online. And these themes all together is a summing thing to help school to frame the school culture when it comes to sexual harassment. So that's one of our tools that we use to help school to focus and to be able to see what is going on when it comes to sexual harassment, and how do we analyze this after they've been answering the survey.
Okay, thank you. Jenny and Maria, the same question for you. Do you have a tool or method for helping schools in Finland with this issue?
I will mention one method, a material about a material called Snippelsnopp. It's in Swedish, but it will be also in Finnish, but it will be translated into English now thanks to the NIC project. So we are really glad of that. But this material is a sexuality education material for 7 to 12-year-old children, so in grades 1 to 6. It includes topics as safety skills, boundaries, for example, and also a different chapter about sexual harassments in the material. It offers tools to talk about different aspects of sexuality and sexual harassments, and it contains about 20 chapters on different themes. And each chapter has a brief introduction to the topic and links to sites with more information and exercises teachers can use with students. And also parents could use these materials, I think. So communication, reflections, feelings and boundaries are in focus throughout the whole material. So So as you heard, we talk about sexual harassment in context of sexual health, because we think that the target groups are more open to listening and reflecting when we talk about this in this manner.
Okay. Thank you.
And we are now also going to develop the material for younger children, so for the daycare settings also.
Thank you. Smilte, kind of the same question for you, because as you said, you're just starting to using sexual harassment as a theme or a topic or as a word, but I know that you've been working for bullying for a couple of years. Can you please mention one method that you use helping schools, kids in Lithuania?
Yeah, we use the same method that Åsa was mentioning. It's a mapping tool, because the main way of how we work with bullying during a few last years is by implementing Friends program in Lithuania. It is a Swedish anti-bullying program, and during this implementation of the program, we have this mapping tool, and just we can screen the situation, how is prevalent sexual harassment. And for example, our numbers are very high, I would say. We know that it's approximately 10% of children that have been the victim of sexual harassment by a student. So it's 1 of 10 child has experienced it, so it's a very high number. And also we address this issue during trainings for the school staff, and we elaborate some special part of training where we discuss what is the sexual harassment, how to recognize this, how to behave if you see it, what to do if it repeatedly happens. But still, I would say the main challenge for our society that bullying problem is recognized. Few years ago, we have a legislation about bullying in schools, but just few years ago. So we are very young on working on it. But if we talk about sexual harassment, it's not recognized. It's in political level. So we have a lot of schools that do not know how to behave. And even, I would say, they do not react when they see it. They do not recognize that it is a problem. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
We are a very small organization, so we are cooperating with a lot of other organizations in these matters, and like Save the Children in Iceland. They are more focused on direct work against sexual harassment than we are, but it comes into our work through the communication with parents, and we have been very focused on, like, when we are working with children, we are meeting children to talk about online bullying and about the friendship and how to respect each other and everything, to include the parents in the discussion. Because it's not enough to talk with the children about these things at school, and then maybe the parents are like bad role models at home, and they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know what is going on. So we have to include the parents in the discussion, so the discussion will go from the school and home, or vice versa. Because like when we were talking about internet safety and screen time and these things, you know, parents aren't the best role models, so we have to address them too and say you can't like forbid your kid to do this and you're constantly doing it yourself. So you always have the phone by you, but you tell your kids that he can't be on the phone all the time. And so I think that's our main focus. We meet class representatives, sorry, it's a bad word, and we have seminars for them. And there we focus on this, like to think about the group as a whole, to have the well-being of every individual in the class in mind. And so like be concerned about other kids and each other. So not focus just on you and your child, but because if there's one child being harassed or bullied in the class, it will affect the well-being of every kid in the class. So we have to address that, you know, we have to be concerned for the others, and especially those who maybe don't have the support at home.
Yes. Thank you. Åsa, back to you again. We have heard a bit about challenges from both Smilte and Bryndis, and also how they could face these challenges. What do you say is a big challenge for prevent bullying in Sweden? And what could friends do to help making that work better?
I think both when it comes to bullying or different kinds of forms of bullying and sexual harassments, including in that. I think you, Smilte, was talking about it earlier, that we see, especially in school, talking to students, is the normalization of their experience, either what they have been subjected to themselves or as a bystander, or as you said, Bryndis, how it affects a class climate or a school climate. And I don't know if it was in one of the quotes from the beginning, that sometimes students are expected to be in this kind of toxic environments when it comes to different forms of harassment. And I think that kind of the normalization to be in that environment, but don't really have the, I don't know if the English word is language, but how you express your experience of being surrounded in that kind of environment is a huge challenge, I think. And just as you said, Smilte, just to talk to the student about this, to show that I am curious about your everyday life in school and what your experience is. I think it's very important to, like a tool to just open up and be able to listen, but also to show that I have knowledge about this, and we really want to include you in this, to know what your experience in this. So I think normalization is one of the, to break the normalization is so important. Yeah.
Thank you. Maria and Jenny will get another question, and it's about this Nordic network that you was very glad to have helped you funded a project. But also, can we see any more winnings and possibilities about this project? What can we get out of this Nordic cooperation, you think?
I think it has been a great journey to be together, and we have increased knowledge now, I think, about the connection between bullying and sexual harassments, and this opportunity to share methods and knowledge between each organization and each countries, so we don't invent the wheel again. For example, the mapping tool from Friends is a really good example about winnings of this project. We didn't have so much knowledge about this, how to talk about, or how to do the mapping, I think, to get a common language. So that was really good for us at Folkhälsan. But also materials that are easy to just to translate, or maybe a platform to share research from different countries, I think. Because it's easy for us to read in Swedish and Norwegian and sometimes in Danish as well, but that's more difficult. But we have a lot of articles, of course, in English. So, but I think this could be something to gain from this project, to have a platform so we could use research from each countries, for example, that addresses bullying and sexual harassment.
Yes. Thank you. And to just a short conclusion, let's start with you, Smilte. What's happening in your organization next in the work with this issue?
What will happen?
What will happen? Yes.
Happen?
What's your next step?
Maybe I would say that our next step is to go deeper in a subject of sexual harassment, and maybe we'll start from trainings, because we had an experience for that, just to have trainings for school staff and talking more, and we feel that it's a good starting point just to make more visible this problem, because this problem is invisible in Lithuanian schools, so maybe it would be the next step in our organization.
Thank you. The same question for you, Bryndis. What's your next step?
So our next step is that we are working with hotline. No, not the one 112. We are making an app, or they are making an app that makes it easier for children to report incidents like sexual harassment or something that they're experiencing, because we feel that maybe it has been hard for them to reach out and ask for the help. So we're hoping that this app will make it easier for them, and that is also relevant to the topic that I discussed earlier about building this platform for kids to be able to communicate and to be able to reach out and tell us what's going on with them, and also encouraging parents to talk more to the children, ask them what's going on in your day and everything. So I agree with everything that you've been saying, and I'm fairly new. I'm sorry. I'm fairly new to the NIC project, so I have still to learn a lot from these fine women here. But I agree with the research and everything, because we're a fairly small country, so we don't maybe have the same finances to make research or do research. So we will benefit from that for sure. And I'm just very enthusiastic and happy to be part of this and looking forward to learning more.
Perfect, and there was actually some perfect last words, I think, from you. Thank you all for coming. Åsa, can you please help with the gifts? Thank you very much. Next speaker, it is Joanna Herat, Senior Program Specialist on Health and Education at UNESCO. Johanna will be with us via Zoom and have her presentation online, but it is live, it's not pre-recorded. Johanna has worked internationally with health and well-being for several years. Within her work at UNESCO, her areas of technical leadership are HIV prevention, comprehensive sexuality education, school-related gender-based violence, early and unintended pregnancy, and gender equality. Joanna will give us a presentation on sexual harassment and violence in school on a global view. So warm digitally welcome to Joanna.
Thank you so much, Calle. Thank you, colleagues in the room. Could you just confirm that you can hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. So I'm very sorry, I can't see you. I don't know who's in the room, but I've been listening to the presentations as they've been made this morning, and there's been some really fantastic presentations. So I'm delighted to be here. It's a real pleasure to be part of this pre-conference, and thank you for your generous introduction there, Calle. So I'm going to continue the conversation on sexual harassment and gender-based violence in school, and looking for a little bit. Sorry, my screen seems to be moving on without me. But I'm going to take a little bit of a step back from the European perspective and share some data and some analysis, but also some conceptual thinking that we from UNESCO have on these issues from around the world. But I also just want to say that I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person. I was unable to travel, but I'm very appreciative for the conference organisers to give me the opportunity to be present and give the presentation by Zoom today. So, we've been talking a lot about harassment. In global terms, we often talk about gender-based violence. There's lots of discussions around violence against women and girls. We've heard this morning that there are many different types of terminology that are being used around the world, and that in many ways it really would be helpful if we could start developing some more common language. And I really agree with those comments. But there are some spaces in our global, in terms of the UN, and the way that member states, or the countries that are members of the UN, create their commitments to dealing with gender-based violence and harassment and violence against women. And some of this language is already enshrined. So in the landmark 1993 Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, this really opened the door for the recognition of the wide variety of forms of violence. And harassment, and specifically sexual harassment, was expressly included there, but also making it very closely linked to violence against women and girls. So I think through the years, what we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years is this idea of sexual harassment being integrated into a broader understanding of gender-based violence, and not only violence against women and girls. And so that not only women and girls are victims, but that harmful gender norms within society are a strong driver for violence, and different people are experiencing that violence in different ways. In 2018, there was the first ever UN resolution on sexual harassment, and this has provided a really strong framework for efforts on this issue. And that means that all countries in the world have signed up to that resolution and are in fact therefore officially recognizing this as an issue. And what that offers is the opportunity for legislation and policy. And it was wonderful to hear earlier today from the three ombudswomen, ombudspersons, who were talking about the role of legislation, which is clearly the first step to shifting what's acceptable and legal in the country, and what we can, how then we can move as activists, as policymakers, as civil society to help enact those laws. I think everybody in this room, I get the impression, is very, very familiar with the issues we're talking about. Some of this data might be new to you, but I wanted to just share it with you as well to give this kind of global snapshot, because these are the different kinds of pieces of data that we're working with on a daily basis. 1 in 3 women worldwide have been subjected to either physical and/or sexual violence in their lifetime by a partner or someone else. 1 in 3 women. Similarly, more than 30% of the world's students have been victims of bullying. So what we're seeing, that's an indicator for us that violence is really incredibly common around the world, including in school settings. And I think all of us here are really very familiar with the devastating consequences of bullying and of other forms of violence in schools and on learners in those situations of a very specific power dynamic, but also where you're in a space which is meant to be a trusted space where you can grow and develop as an individual, but where that trust is broken when you experience violence, sometimes the impacts can be even more serious than in other spaces. And finally, there are millions and millions of children around the world who are not even protected from the most basic form of safety in school, and that's protection from corporal punishment. And we heard a little bit about that earlier, and we understand more and more now why that legislation is so important. And then all the work that has to go alongside that to work with teachers to help everybody in the school community understand and put in place different ways of promoting positive discipline and working with learners to create a safe and supportive environment. This is some more data, a little snapshot. It's a recent analysis by an organisation called Together for Girls, who use the violence against children surveys and analyse them often with a gender lens to look at specifically what violence is being reported in schools. So we can see here that both boys and girls are experiencing sexual and/or physical violence, with boys often reporting higher levels. So for example, here in Kenya, we can see that almost 40% of boys are reporting having experienced some forms of violence. There's some indication that sexual violence experience is higher amongst girls than amongst boys, but we must not be led into the trap of thinking that boys are not experiencing sexual violence, because they are. This graphic helps us to understand the cultural contexts in which violence is happening, because obviously violence isn't happening in a vacuum, and violence in schools is not happening in a vacuum. Schools are part of the wider social fabric, and the way that teachers behave, the way that learners behave, the way that parents expect schools to be run are part of those national, cultural, or localized social norms. So this graphic tells us a little bit about the attitudes towards violence, and specifically attitudes towards violence against women in different countries. So it's a graphic that comes from the OECD. So thanks to them for their work on this. And the question that's asked is, the data is on the percentage of women specifically. So men and women are asked, but this data shows the percentage of women who agree that a husband or a partner is justified in beating his wife or his partner under certain circumstances. And there's a list of circumstances which include things like if she burns the food or goes out without him, things like that. And I think the dots here, the size of the dots, show the scale of support for this particular attitude. And what's often very interesting is to see the extent to which women feel that violence is normalized and expected and justified. So I would highlight a couple of countries here just for your interest. I think many of us know if we were to look, for example, the dots in Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the response rates are very high. 75% of women feel that that's justified. But I'd also draw your attention to Sweden, because you can see there's a dot there, and the data point there is 10% of women who feel that a man would be justified in beating his wife under circumstances. So what can we do to understand and address violence in school? Many people here at the conference are talking and focused on bullying, and I think that's been extremely important to unpack and understand those longer term forms of psychological violence. For us, we talk a lot about violence, gender-based violence. We also highlight bullying as one form of violence, just as gender is a driver of violence. So at UNESCO, we are committed to supporting countries to put in place evidence-based programs to both prevent and respond to violence, including gender-based violence in schools. So it's really important that we understand the wide range of forms of violence that can take place in different schools in order to better respond to them. I'm going to share with you now some little vignettes, some human stories. These vignettes are taken from real life experiences of learners, and we use them. Excuse me, my slides seem to have a mind of their own. We use these vignettes in a range of our materials, our training materials, and our work with teachers, but also with policymakers, to help illustrate what violence can look like in the school setting. So it's the first step to recognizing and acknowledging that violence might well be happening, which is often a very, very difficult step for school leaders to take, but also for learners. And we'll hear a bit more about that in a minute. And it opens the door for conversations to understand and to talk about violence in a way that focuses on the human story, on the victim or the bystander, and then allows us to have a conversation about what could be done differently. In this first vignette, a pubescent adolescent is mocked for her changing body by a male peer, and this verbal harassment is accompanied by physical and sexual harassment. I'll give you a moment to read the content. I think that this is a situation that many of us recognize. It's probably likely to have happened in countries around the world, maybe even to some of us in the room personally. And I think it helps, it highlights the issue that puberty continues to be an extremely challenging period for all young people, male, female, gender non-conforming, and that we aren't yet doing enough to help create common conversations, common language, and comfort around that period of transition from childhood to adulthood, and what in some places might be the over-sexualization of young people at this age. Here we have a classic example of corporal punishment. We often also hear stories when it's talking about adolescent boys and beating. We often hear the use of homophobic language in these settings. So be like a girl, take it like a man, stop acting like a girl. And we heard a lot earlier. About the use of homophobic language and how closely entwined that is with other forms of violence. So not only the incredibly devastating effects that has on the victims, we understand more and more about what that means for bystanders, but what would the impact of that be for everybody in that classroom, hearing a young man being told to act like a man, stop acting like a girl? What does that mean for the girls in the classroom? What does it mean for the other boys and men in the classroom? In some school settings, the buildings themselves can create insecurities. And this is something that we see particularly in our work in some African countries and in some Asian countries, I think probably much less so in Europe, but thinking about the school infrastructure and how do we create safe environments. So here we have the example of a group of boys who are taking advantage of the lack of toilets to abuse a young woman's privacy. But what's interesting in this example is that we're seeing a bystander who's very uncomfortable with this situation, but doesn't know what to do about it. And those are the opportunities we have to work with. So through our work to document the evidence and to provide guidance on addressing violence in schools, UNESCO, in collaboration with a number of academics and other organisations, has developed a conceptual framework for understanding violence in schools. And here you can see from this diagram, we see that it's the act or the threat of sexual, physical, or psychological violence. And there's many areas of overlap and experiences of violence we know don't fit into neat boxes, but it is helpful for us to have this wider conceptual framework to be able to begin those conversations with policymakers and with national governments to say, these things are happening in your schools, here is the evidence. For example, in settings like this, where we're able to hear from academics and researchers, such as many of you in the room, and we can hear what's happening, what responses are effective, what the data's saying, and we can go to other countries and say, this is what we know, this is what works. And that's why we're part of partnerships like the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children and the Safe to Learn programme, which is part of that. So these forms of violence, what's been interesting for us as we do this work in different countries, many of them aren't traditionally seen as violence. The words, even the words and language are different. It's teasing, not bullying. And that's a big part of the work, is coming up to this common language and understanding that actually teasing is often more than that, and it's psychologically damaging for an individual. So understanding what the impacts of different forms and acts of violence are. So I think it's universally agreed that caning a child or hitting a child is a form of violence, and that's often measured, and there's laws around that. But coercion, harassment, and those kinds of types of violence are more hotly debated, and it's more challenging to come to a common understanding in different places. But I think finally, it's really critical to underline that when we're talking about violence, including gender-based violence, and I think everybody here has been saying this morning, that the victims may be children, so learners, or they could also be adults in the school community. But also the perpetrators may be adults, could be teachers or other members of the school community, but also could be children. And there we're talking a lot about peer violence, peer physical violence, but also bullying. So, as we've seen this morning, sexual harassment is a form of gender-based violence, and it's really critical to apply a gender lens to any response to school violence in order to have a deeper and more nuanced understanding, and then to be able to respond appropriately. So we know that violence is shaped by the gender and power inequities and the norms in a society, and that these norms condition how girls and boys act. We also know that the experience of violence can be very different for girls, for boys, and for learners who are LGBTQI. And I was very much interested and influenced by what Professor Dorothy Espelage was saying earlier, and when she was talking about the use of homophobic language, because not only in and of itself is it an egregious form of abuse of another individual, of one's peers, and it's heavily rooted in the hegemonic norms of masculinity, but it has to be seen as part of this analysis of gender-based violence. So LGBTQI learners need specific support and specific safe spaces because of the very particular issues that they themselves may be facing, and the isolation and marginalization at home and also within school, and we know that. But we also now are learning that we really mustn't separate this from wider discussions about that homophobic and transphobic bullying mustn't be separated from wider discussions about gender-based violence. And that's also linked to what Professor Espelage was saying about the predictors of violence against peer violence, starting also with that use of that homophobic language. So just finally, to just reflect on the fact that we're talking about power imbalances in many different ways and different kinds of victims, here are two other vignettes, two examples that demonstrate that teachers can also be victims. Here on the left in the purple box, we have an example of a young female teacher who's beginning her career and is put in a very difficult situation by an older male teacher of sexual harassment. How do you deal with that harassment in the workplace? How do you potentially stand up for equality and for your learners when you yourself are experiencing that in your own workplace? On the right, there's the example of a young student, and this is something that we've seen documented in a number of countries, a young student whose parents are very happy for her to be helpful and show respect towards a teacher in her community. Teachers are often respected individuals, but what happens when that line is crossed and that teacher then begins to abuse that learner? Who is responsible in that situation, and how do we shift that pattern and create a safe situation for that young woman? I want to talk to you briefly now about a particular curriculum-based tool which UNESCO has supported the development of. And it was interesting to hear in the last panel about some of the curriculum tools that are being developed in other countries. And in fact, this follows in some ways a very similar pattern. So this is a program which we're supporting in a few countries, but it fits within a whole school approach. And I really want to just insist on that fact that I will be talking to you about this particular curriculum. But for us, the importance is the idea that in order to address violence in schools, you have to have this whole educational, whole school approach, which includes policies, it includes a safe environment, it includes curriculum, interventions, it includes work with teachers, but also with school boards and engagement with parents, and also quite an active monitoring system in place. And this is all written up in the different UNESCO guidance and so on. And in fact, I believe there's a session this afternoon, if I'm not mistaken, on the whole education approach led by UNESCO, and I would encourage you to attend that if you're able to. So today I'm just going to talk briefly about this curriculum approach, which reflects evidence and good practice in social and emotional learning and building critical thinking skills, which really builds on what some of the earlier speakers have spoken about, the need for relationships education or comprehensive sexuality education, or many different names we have to call it, but I think we're all talking about the same thing, which is how can learners learn to be more critically astute and think about the relationships that they have and how to make sure those are healthy, and how to recognize violence and what to do when they see violence. And so the curriculum is very much on this, and it's aimed at a specific age group where gender norms are becoming fixed and peer relationships are becoming the most important influence for adolescents. So the program is called Connect with Respect. It's a curriculum-based approach to prevent school-related gender-based violence, or it's actually to prevent gender-based violence. It's designed for delivery in schools with students aged 11 to 14 years, and it can be integrated into an existing personal social health education curriculum, or it could be delivered as a standalone. It's informed by research which shows that effective, respectful relationships programs use rights-based approaches, that they engage students in critical thinking about social, cultural, and institutional influences, and that they provide opportunities to build social skills via engagement with scenarios and rehearsal strategies. So it's very active pedagogy. Connect with Respect is designed to help students understand concepts such as gender, gender-based violence, rights, and as I mentioned, promoting social and emotional learning. There's a really strong component of teacher preparation, which helps teachers look at their own values, their own attitudes towards gender and violence before then going in and teaching the course. And I think for me, that component of the teacher education speaks a little bit to what Calle was saying earlier, which is about building a common language in the staff room and within the school environment so that everybody knows what we're talking about when we say this is violence, or when we say no to harassment, or what is harassment, what do we understand that to be, what behaviours does that include? And that's one of the reasons why this kind of a programme can really help shift norms at a school level if a large number of students are going through the programme and developing a common understanding and a common language. Just to acknowledge the authors of the programme, Connect with Respect was initially commissioned by UNESCO and developed by the University of Melbourne with involvement of various partners in Asia. And in the last 2 years, it's undergone an adaptation and localisation process for countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, still with the University of Melbourne team. And you can find the toolkit if you click on this flash code, it'll take you to the link. And very soon, this is the Asia version, and very soon the Africa version will be published and made available. But actually, I believe that many of the contents and the examples and the exercises really could be adapted and used in any different country setting. So the program's been piloted in a number of countries. Mixed method evaluation has been done alongside the pilot with both student perceptions, teacher perceptions, looking at the extent to which it was implemented, but also the factors of constraining and enabling the provision, but also tracking the impacts of the programme on students' experiences of peer-perpetrated bullying and gender-based violence and their bystander capabilities. And it also looked at teacher and student perceptions about the programme. In Africa, it was piloted in Eswatini, Tanzania, Zambia, and in Asia, it was piloted in Thailand and Timor-Leste. There was also a small pilot in Vietnam, but we didn't include the data from that. Just to give you a quick snapshot of the scale, there was a mixture of students. This is just the student data. So 9,000 students across 5 countries, fairly equally distributed between girls and boys, and there were also student focus groups. The results from the pilot will be being published in the coming months. So this really just is a kind of early little snapshot of a few key findings, but we'll be happy to share the findings with you soon. So the first thing we wanted to ask was, what is your appreciation of this program? Do you think it's useful? Did you enjoy it? Was it meaningful for you? And so on, which we think often actually doesn't get asked very often of young people. What did you make of this? And overall, students really placed a high value on the program, with over 90% saying that all schools should teach about the prevention of gender-based violence. Interestingly, the positive responses were lower in countries with lower levels of implementation, because yes, it's a pilot across many countries, and mostly it was delivered during COVID period. So some challenges in implementation there, but so different levels of implementation in the different countries. The other thing that was interesting is that girls were more likely to agree with this statement than boys. So perhaps there's a little bit more to be done to bring boys on board as allies and believers that gender equality is important for them. So the program really had value for learners in terms of helping them build their relationship skills. Over 3/4 of the students said the lessons helped them develop their relationship skills. And over 70% found, and 77% found that doing the Connect with Respect lessons always or mostly improved these skills. Again, the agreement rates were higher in the countries with the highest implementation levels and lower in those countries where they didn't deliver the comprehensive set of lessons. And I think this quote from a learner in Thailand is really useful reflection for us, the sense that it helps to create better relationships between classmates, to have better understanding of one's friends, but also to be careful with one's friends' feelings. Don't bully friends, help them. And I think those are the kinds of intentions and attitudes that we all want to see coming out of these programs. In terms of the attitudes towards gender and gender-based violence, and here this is a reflection of the data that I presented earlier, the proportion of students who agreed that it was okay for a husband to beat his wife decreased in the post-intervention surveys in all of the countries. So what we're really seeing is that these kinds of programs do shift gender attitudes. And we know that equitable gender equitable attitudes are a precursor to reductions in gender-based violence. So how are peers relating to one another? Is there continued violence amongst those peer groups within the schools? So the analysis of the student data at country level shows a decline in the proportion of students who reported that they experienced sexual touching by peers of the opposite sex in almost all of the countries. So that's also a very promising result for this program, and a demonstration at a relatively small scale, we accept. But a promising suggestion that these programs can actually have an impact on behaviours and on young people's safety. There's one country where with an exception, and sometimes what we've seen, and I've seen this in other violence prevention programs, that actually in the first phase after a program's implemented, because of the higher rates of understanding of what violence is, sometimes the reported rates of violence can go up in the first instance as more people saying, well, I've experienced this action. I didn't previously realize that this was violence, but now I do recognize it as violence and I'm going to report it as such. But we're still exploring some of those intricacies. So the next thing that was really important for us in this program is to help young people recognize and understand when they might need help or their friends might need help, and how they would go about seeking that help. And there really was a marked increase in knowledge of how to look for help, but for someone affected by gender-based violence. At the baseline, less than half of the students reported that they knew how to get help for someone who's affected by gender-based violence, but this increased to over 2/3 in this sample at the endpoint. And in general, girls indicated higher levels of confidence than boys about how to source help. And here are some of the quotes from young people about what they felt would be important. You know, we must help each other, disregard sex. It doesn't matter whether you're a girl or a boy. Everybody is a friend. Don't harm or mock them, but let's help and take care of each other. And in Zambia, you know, it's important to know where help can be found, because gender-based violence can happen to anyone, and those that are affected feel lonely and isolated and need support. So what we're really seeing is increasing compassion and understanding. So to conclude, We know that rates of violence, including gender-based violence and sexual harassment, are high around the world. We don't have enough good quality data of what is actually happening in schools, but through the levels of violence in the wider community and through the violence that is reported in schools, for example, bullying or corporal punishment, we do know that there are high levels of violence, and we need to have good, strong conceptual frameworks and whole of education approaches to be able to ensure that young people learn in safe and supportive environments for their own well-being, but also for their educational outcomes. So despite the high levels of violence and also the acceptance of unequal gender norms, school-based programs can be effective in shifting knowledge, attitudes, and intended behaviours in a variety of different country contexts. It could be as effective in Norway in the same way that it could be effective in Zambia as in Vietnam. Teachers do need careful support to begin to address these challenging and sensitive topics. They are not always easy to talk about. We don't always have a common language, as we've heard today. And teachers need support to be able to teach a curriculum to a high standard. So we need to start with evidence-based interventions based on what we know about adolescent development, about child development, but we also need teachers to be able to deliver those in an effective way. So happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for your time and attention today, and look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Joanna. And as Joanna just said, is there any questions from the audience? Just raise your hand so I can see you. Joanna, we also have a small present for you here, but I think that you have some colleagues in the room. Maybe I can give it to them, and hopefully it will come to you in a safe way. What I can see, there are no questions from the audience. Also, you have made yourself crystal clear, so thanks for that, and thank you for being a part of this pre-conference. A round of applause for Johanna Herat.
Thank you very much.
And actually, this was all the presentation and all the panel discussions that were a part of the program on this pre-conference. But before we finish this and let WABF take over, we will have some minutes of reflection. And here to help us with reflection is Olle Pallin-Cox. Welcome down. Are you already on your way? He has been sitting here the whole time, knowing that the last minutes would be his time on stage, just to help us to reflect this morning. Good to know for you is that Olle is a former colleague for us at Friends. He has also worked with Victim Support Sweden, BRIS, that is a children's rights in society, and works right now as head of policy and advocacy at Youth 2030. And that's a movement, and that's a Swedish NGO committed to ensuring that rights for children and adolescents to have an impact and influence on society and on the Swedish democracy. Welcome, Olle, and I just let you take over this reflection time.
Thank you very much. I have a few minutes. I will use them wisely. I want to start off by thanking all of you. You have awoken the activist in me these hours, and I'll try to let that activist have some room here. I'm not here to give you any answers. I'm here to maybe raise some questions, maybe provoke some of you, but that's fine. Someone has to do that job, and today that is me. We're all here today to make things better for children. Hilde said it earlier that we have very good intentions as adults. And I would even say that in Sweden, we're quite good at listening to children. We ask them, what do you think? And what's your thoughts about this? And we're quite good at this. But the next step, we're not as good as letting what children tells us also affect our decisions. So we stop at listening. We're really good at listening, but we don't let what children tell us also affect our decisions. Why is this? Well, I think we have several explanations for this, of course. Elisabeth Dahli said earlier that she gets really irritated when adults say that I know what it is to be a child because I was a child before, like 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But this is a problem because we today, I'm 41 and I don't have the perspective of a 15-year-old. So it's an insult saying to a 15-year-old that I know how it is to be like you because I was once 15. This is a problem. Another problem is that I think that we far too often view children as very fragile. These persons that we need to protect, that we put on a pedestal and we don't want to, harm them. And this is also made often in good intention, but this hinders us from taking the child's perspective. The perspective stops us from letting children talk about and affect also the hardest parts of their lives, the stuff that we've talked about today, bullying and sexual harassment. With this framework, Katja talked about her research, which is very important. I'm sure that the posters that she showed affected you as well as it affected me. Brindi said that when we ask children, there's a river coming of words. And this is also my experience, working at Friends, going around to schools and meeting children, that when you ask them, they will answer. Dorothy and Katja and Brinder also talked about toxic masculinity. It's hard to not get affected, but how did we end up here? We know that toxic masculinity, that bullying, that harassment is a fact, and still nothing happens, or at least a little too little happens. So what's in the way for us stopping and ending bullying and sexual harassment? Well, I have 4 part explanations, but not, of course, the full pictures. One is that we don't take what children tells us seriously. Joanna said that we call it teasing instead of violence. And all of us have these stories of adults downplaying what children actually go through. A second one is that it's really hard for us as adults talking about sexual harassment and bullying. I guess that many of us are afraid. What will happen when we ask a 15-year-old about the experience of sexual harassment? I've had the exact same experience at other conferences. Raised the hand saying, why aren't children in this room when we're talking about sexual harassment? And have you gotten the answers like, it's unthinkable. We should not have children here because this is dangerous and we should not talk about children. Talked about children about this. But how can we talk about sexual harassment on children without having children in the room? A third one is that it has to do with how we as adults create the attitude and norms against bullying, violence, and sexual violence. This, of course, has to do with it. And the last one is that children aren't allowed by us to set the agenda. Gudrun said that you arranged a conference, and the people in Iceland got really provoked because it was the children setting the agenda for the conference. And I think that it's undemocratic that children aren't allowed to set the agenda. So children aren't present in the rooms where we make decisions. Why? Is it too scary? Are we afraid of what we will awake, what questions and what answers we will awake? I know that it's hard. I know that that there are risks, but I also know that children really, really want to give their perspective on what they live on a weekly and daily basis, what they experience. So, to conclude, I have a proposal for the next World Anti-Bullying Forum, or maybe the pre-conference. We should not only include children into this room, we should change the perspective upside down. At WABF 2023, children should be the ones inviting us adults into the pre-conference on bullying and sexual harassment. Of course, there are risks, but we have the tool to address those risks. We have to be brave. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Olle, for your wise words. And maybe you have awakened some kind of activist in me as well. And also, WABF will end with a call for host. Maybe Youth 2030 should take the chance.
Yes, we should.
Thank you. The only thing I want to say is a big thank you to all the speakers, all the members of the different kind of panels, of Olle, to Olle as well. And a very big thank you to the Nordic Council of Ministers. Thanks to you been listening here today. And let's meet later on at WABF, I hope. Have a nice WABF, everybody, and thank you for coming.